Just before I start the video, I'd like to thank you all for 200 subscribers. And yes, I know this video is a little late, but I completely forgot that I was going down to the caravan when I said it'd be out in the end of May. I'll also make a lot more videos from here, so hopefully I should make one every couple of weeks, but when it comes to putting dates on things, I'm not the best at it. Anyway, all that aside, it's time to have a look at the post-war housing crisis. As fighting raged during the Second World War, Churchill ordered a small bombing raid over Berlin. More than anything, this was to wind Hitler up, and it worked, as Hitler started turning his attention away from the RAF's bases and started focusing attacks on civilian areas, specifically in London. The Luftwaffe had embarked on a campaign of bombing runs over UK cities. England and Wales were the primary targets, but some bombing runs did reach Scotland. Glasgow wasn't damaged nearly as much as cities like London, but many homes were still destroyed and people were displaced by the bombing runs. When World War II ended in 1945, Britain found itself with a new challenge to face: reconstruction. In the general election, despite being one of the most popular Prime Ministers, Winston Churchill was voted out and replaced by Clement Attlee. I guess this was sensible, however, as Attlee did go on to make quite a bit of good for the country, such as founding the NHS, and was critical to post-war reconstruction. Churchill would return in 1951, and he'd proved to be below average for a peacetime Prime Minister. Clearly, his skills were in wartime leadership. Attlee had done a lot for the reconstruction, but he didn't finish it. There were still a lot of issues to deal with, and as I said in my Red Road video, Britain sent scientists to Marseille in France to have a look at ways to solve the housing issues. They discovered the idea of high-rise living, and because Britain was in a rush to build as many homes as possible for the people made homeless by the war, tower blocks just seemed to be the natural solution. Later, I'll explain why this wasn't a great idea, but at the time, it seemed like a genius plan. Around 750,000 new homes were estimated to be in demand, and they needed to start building them as soon as possible. Now, those whose homes were destroyed by the Luftwaffe weren't the only ones facing a housing crisis. There were also the 15 million soldiers returning from World War II who needed to be housed as well. But people who already had a home as well had to suffer with this post-war housing crisis because the homes they lived in were not the good quality that we have these days. Most of the working class at the time lived in slum tenements, several families living in a building 3 or 4 stories tall, crammed together with very little living space. Residents of these tenements usually had to share a toilet, which was usually nothing more than a hole dug outside in the mud. The living conditions at the time for working class people were appalling, and in modern standards, it would be considered against human rights to even have to live in them. These tenements were built in the Victorian era, a time where quality of life for the working class people was never a concern at all. They had children as young as 4 years old working in the coal mines, making clothes in a mill such as the ones in New Lanark, or sweeping chimneys at the time. Today this seems completely outlandish, but in those days it's what you had to do to survive. In 1951, the first tower block in the UK was constructed. Known as the Lawn, it was built in Harlow, Essex. With this building's construction, a new era in post-war housing had begun. These tower blocks were a huge step up from the slum tenements. They offered better living space, more privacy, toilets in your own home, and showers. Again, all of this sounds commonplace now, but as recently as 60 years ago, these would have been considered as luxuries. As the standard of living shot up dramatically, so too did the ratings of these blocks. Tower blocks were at first seen as very nice and pleasant places to live. 99% of the tower blocks built after the war had this exact same feeling when they were first built. Glasgow saw the most tower blocks being constructed during this time period, as they would build them here from the early 1950s all the way up until the 1970s. If you look at pictures of the Glasgow skyline at the time, and in some parts of the city even today, there are hundreds of these buildings present, but by the 1970s and 1980s, the first signs of trouble had already begun to arise. Because these buildings were designed based on the ones the scientists had seen in Marseille, there were quite obviously issues that would arise from this. Marseille and many cities in the UK have a completely different climate, and building tower blocks with flat roofs in a country where you can get 4 seasons in one day with plenty of rain would certainly cause a few issues. Even early on, these tower blocks were notorious for dampness problems directly attributed to poor design choices. As more and more of these buildings were built, they started rushing development and using the prefabricated construction method, and as a result, quality was a second concern. This would turn out to be a recipe for disaster, because in 1968 the Ronan Point disaster occurred. I don't want to go into too much detail about the Ronan Point disaster here, because spoiler alert, that building will be my next video. But a gas explosion occurred in the corner of the tower block in London, which caused the corner of it to partially collapse, tragically killing 4 of the residents, which was later found to be due to poor construction quality. By the 1980s and 1990s, these tower blocks were no longer seen as the beautiful and modern housing that they once were. Now they were seen as low quality housing, and it didn't help when a lot of the original residents of these buildings passed away, and in their place, people such as drug addicts and alcoholics and ex-convicts began being moved in by the local councils. By now, people would usually avoid the stairwells in a lot of tower blocks. This is where you would find graffiti and addicts taking drugs. People stopped taking turns to clean the landings, like they used to in the 1950s and 60s. Many wouldn't know their neighbours anymore, and tower blocks became synonymous with crime, addiction and low housing quality. Then in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the council started putting immigrants in these blocks. Now, there were some language barriers to overcome to talk to your neighbours, because in a lot of cases, these refugees were displaced by wars, and they never expected to be living in this country, so as a result, not all of them had a great understanding of English. Even more problems began to arise from there. Asbestos was used in huge quantities while constructing these buildings. The thing about asbestos is that it can kill you even if you've only been in its presence for 5 minutes. It's quite literally more dangerous than standing next to the elephant's foot in Chernobyl. There is no such thing as a safe amount of asbestos. Even the smallest amount can lead to a variety of lung cancer, which is almost always fatal, and many other health conditions that could shorten life expectancies by a great deal, but back then it was just swept under the rug. The reason it was used in such high quantities is because it made the buildings slightly more resistant to fire. Asbestos was used as fireproofing. More recently, with asbestos being removed in a lot of buildings these days, a new issue has arose: cladding. Much of the cladding used in these buildings was highly flammable, and now that asbestos has been completely removed in most cases, although some traces of it do remain, there's usually nothing stopping the cladding from going up in flames and causing major amounts of damage. Arguably what killed the tower block once and for all in the UK was the Grenfell tower disaster. Due to the cladding I mentioned earlier, a small fire in one of the flats caused by a refrigerator engulfed half of the building. One of the worst tower block disasters of our time. 72 people lost their lives as the flames covered much of the upper parts of the building. The fire burned for 60 hours before it was finally extinguished. By the time it was, almost everything above the 4th floor was completely destroyed. 6 years on, the building still stands there as a sad reminder of the tragedy, although there are plans to demolish it and build a memorial to the victims in its place. After the disaster, many tower blocks were discovered to have the same type of cladding, including 2 blocks at Caledonia Road in Glasgow. Many of these buildings are lined up for demolition, and just like the slum tenements that came before them, tower blocks are slowly fading into history as a thing of the past. The number of these post-war housing relics is expected to dwindle in the coming years, until eventually only a few will remain standing as listed buildings. The Lawn is one of the few tower blocks to be listed as a historic building. As Britain's first tower block, there is a huge argument for keeping it, and it doesn't look like that building will be going anywhere anytime soon. Well, that was it. I hope you all enjoyed my video on the post-war housing crisis, and I'll see you in my next video about the Ronan Point tower block and disaster. By the way, tell me if you like these kinds of videos as opposed to the usual ones about the stories of individual tower blocks, which can get quite repetitive. This was probably my favourite video to research and write besides the Red Road video, so if you find the kind of stuff interesting, please do let me know and I'll make more like this. I'll see you next time.